Now. So hi and welcome to Globalsportscare. Today it's a pleasure to introduce Martin Turner. Martin and I, we worked at a football association. Martin is a sports psychologist and has an interest, obviously, in how to make athletes perform better. Martin, hello.
Hello, Marcus. Thanks for inviting me.
And I can see the nice sunshine in the only sunny day in Britain, you told me.
That's it. Yeah, I'm going to try to get a tan on just this day.
Can you tell me a little bit about yourself and what you do and what your interests are?
Yeah, sure. So yes, as you said, I'm Martin Turner. At the moment, I'm working at Manchester Metropolitan University as a reader in psychology there, which is lots of research, some consultancy and some teaching. And really over the past 10 years, I've spent most of my time researching and working around the areas of emotion control and performance under stress and pressure. So that involves collecting data, writing research papers that try to illustrate how we can help people to control their emotions, but also working with individuals and teams within sport and other contexts, other what we would say performance contexts, to help those individuals and teams to fulfill their potential, in difficult, adverse moments.
And the main question I think I want to answer today is how can we actually improve mental performance? And is there much scientific evidence out there which could answer this question?
So it's a really big question, and it's one that I guess, as a sport and exercise psychologist going in to work with individuals and teams, it's a question that's asked quite frequently from performance directors and head coaches. What is what you do actually helpful for performance in the end? So yeah, we can absolutely get into that question. I have my way of working with teams and individuals, and other people have their own ways, but largely within sport and exercise psychology, we base our ideas more commonly around a cognitive behavioral idea of there's an association or a link or an interaction between how we think, how we feel, our emotions and our behaviors. And those three things together, if we can point them in the right direction for performance, should enable an athlete to fulfill their potential. Now, fulfillment of potential isn't necessarily you will win today. If you don't have a competency and a skill level and ability level in order to succeed within a particular sport, when competing against other people, then psychology is only going to take you so far. But when you're working with individuals who've honed their abilities and their skills, psychology can make quite a difference, so it kind of depends on the level when you're talking about, does it influence performance,
How much would you say in this context education is important of the athlete?
In terms of educating them around what sport is like and what they can expect?
Yes, or basic education of life skills and school education and how to reflect on yourself. What is an emotion, or how do I deal with emotions, such things.
Yeah, it's really important. I think more and more these days now we're recognizing that there are aspects of the sporting environment that aren't necessarily conducive to health, mental health and also physical health, which is a bit of a paradox. We sometimes assume that athletes must be really, really healthy physically and mentally, but that's often not the case. As we look at that more deeply, we start to realize that it's partially about how they handle themselves within sport, but it's actually quite a large portion of that health and well-being piece is around how they handle life generally and what they're doing outside of the sport. So I think an individual who has good life skills, however you want to define that, can probably better look after themselves within sporting contexts, which are quite unforgiving, and sport can be quite brutal. One day you're on a high, the next day the coach has dropped you for whatever reason. One day you're physically feeling really good, and the next day you have an injury that puts you out for 6 weeks, 8 weeks, or even a season, or even it's potentially career ending. And those individuals that can think take a perspective, understand where sport fits within their lives, are often better able to cope with those things. If I perceive sport as everything that I am and in the be all and end all, and failure is a catastrophe and it's live or die, then when I face really significant adversity, it's more difficult for me to come back from those things, you know.
Mm. And when we come back to the big question, how can we improve mental performance? Is there a framework you have developed or think about when you approach this question?
Yeah, there is. I think that any practitioner, I think any practitioner that's interested in working from an evidence base bases their practice on frameworks, on ideas, common themes that link together that might help us to structure the provision of sports psychology when we're working with individual teams. And for me, I take what's called a cognitive behavioral therapy approach, which, as I've kind of mentioned before, is this link between thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. That's kind of my main background. But within that, over the past probably 9 or 10 years, I've been using two main things. One of them is called challenge and threat, which I tend to call tipping the balance, which is also the name of one of my books. Tipping the balance is a framework in which we can help athletes and anybody in any performance context really to try to think in ways that are more conducive for controlling their emotions, controlling their thoughts and behaviors in performance, because we know that the ability to manage those factors when you're under pressure, when you're striving towards something meaningful, can help you to fulfill your potential. So that's kind of tipping the balance, which we can kind of get into. And the other one is something called smarter thinking, which has its basis in something called rational emotive behavior therapy. And fundamentally, what rational emotive behavior therapy, or REBT, helps you to understand is that whilst the situation might be adverse, difficult, and tough, it's how we think about the situation that really dictates our emotional response and therefore our behaviors and therefore can influence performance. So the tipping the balance and smarter thinking are conceptually related. They're both cognitive behavioral. It's how you think that counts, that influences emotions and behaviors, but they have a slightly different mode of working and a different slant. I tend to draw on both of those things to give me a comprehensive way of working with individuals towards performance.
And are there specific examples, of athletes' behaviors you see regularly?
Yeah, absolutely. So within one of the things within tipping the balance or challenge and threat that we've been doing in research and in the applied work is trying to understand, is there a connection between how somebody thinks and how their bodies respond? And we can see that kind of objectively when we encourage people to face pressure. We can measure what's happening in the cardiovascular system, and that can give us an indication on whether they're responding in a way that's conducive to good performance or challenge, or conducive to poorer performance or threat. And you can see that every day you watch sport, you see that there's individuals who have a potential to be fulfilled and often fall under that potential. They're capable of doing more, but they don't quite get there. And often that's less of a physical issue and more of a mental issue. They weren't able to deal with that pressure in that moment. And that really captures a lot of sport quite nicely, especially at the elite level. We have individuals who have a really high competency or quite similar in their ability to execute skills at a high level. But psychology often is the difference between whether they succeed or fail. And one of the key areas you can look at in terms of that phenomenon is penalty shootouts. Taking an elite footballer, asking them to do something relatively simple given their skill level, kick a ball from a short distance away into a huge goal where the odds are in your favor, and you will see athletes often fail in that scenario. Now, it is unlikely that any physical aspect is going to influence their ability to do that when you're looking at the elite level. It's more likely that there's a psychological mediator there. There's something psychological, something about dealing with that pressure that then influences the skill execution. So I think if you're if you're interested in how psychology influences performance and you look at the elite end, you can really see how performance under pressure can really ruin the performances of highly competent individuals.
And you address this then individually with one-to-one sessions to find out the individual causes, or is there again something you would say you can apply to almost everyone?
I think, you know, coming from the frameworks that I come from, you treat every individual as an individual and see what's going on, you know, and the first part of working with somebody, whether it's a team or an individual, is to really take on information. You know, what are the ways in which they approach performance? What are the ways in which they regulate their emotions and control their emotions and behaviors and their thoughts? Usually those individuals have got an idea for what's going on, what's going wrong in their performance, or ways in which they're falling below what they would expect themselves to achieve. They normally have an idea, and what they're interested in from me is potential solutions. Sometimes things are revealed that they didn't realize. That's a causal factor for them not achieving what they want to achieve. So you can enlighten them in some ways just based on the information you're giving. The information they're giving you as a practitioner, you can kind of piece things together and say, well, have you considered that it's maybe because you're thinking in this way, it might be influencing your emotions, which might be influencing your performance. So things come to light. But I would say that quite often the individual has a good idea about what's not quite going well, and what they want is some way forward, some kind of solution. So within the tipping the balance framework, try to help people to develop really robust beliefs around self-confidence. So can they back themselves when the going gets tough? Do they believe in their abilities to perform within specific situations? We focus on control. So can I control the things that it's possible for me to control? And when I'm going into a pressure situation, focus on those controllables. Don't focus on all of these other things that you can't control, which might influence your performance. Accept those things, but try to focus on the things you can control. And then thirdly, can I have a positive outlook towards performance? Can I focus on the things that I'm going to do well in today's game, rather than all the ways in which I could mess up, all the ways I'm going to disappoint people and fall below my expectations? So often when I'm working with people, there's a deficit in one of those things, you know, often, not always, but often they might have some confidence issues around, you know, I'm not really backing myself to perform. I'm not really sure I can do this. They are focusing on things they can't control, or they understand what the controllables are. They just need to be instigated to start to control those things. Or they tend to go into performances with a bit of a negative mindset, like, oh, today's just going to be the same as the last game. I'm not going to do well, and the coach is going to think I'm an idiot. And so you're trying to address those things and get them to point themselves meaningfully and forthrightly and positively in the direction of whatever can help your performance. And that normally means I back myself to perform well, I focus on the things I can control, and I look forward to demonstrating my skills and making the most of this opportunity. So from that framework, that's kind of that basis. And the reason is that when a performer goes into a pressure situation, there are certain demands that are within that situation. They're usually uncertain. We don't know if we're going to win or not. They're normally highly requiring of effort. It's tough. It's hard for me to succeed. You know, that's why partially why sport is so interesting. And thirdly, it's dangerous. It's dangerous to my esteem. I could embarrass myself in this situation, you know. There's people depending on me. There's expectations. It's quite dangerous. What I need to be able to deal with those demands is resources. And the three main resources that we use in that tipping the balance framework are confidence, control, and a positive focus towards what I want to do. So that's that tipping the balance framework. Don't let the demands outweigh the resources. Let the resources outweigh the demands. Put yourself in a good position to maximize your potential within that particular performance.
And would you say you always need a psychologist or practitioner like yourself to get this framework, or is it something you can build yourself as an athlete?
I don't know whether you always need a psychologist, but you definitely need to have an understanding of your psychology as an athlete. In what, when you think about times you performed really, really well, what are the ways that you were thinking and feeling and behaving prior to that performance, during that performance, and after that performance? And similarly, times where you haven't performed as you expected or didn't fulfill your potential, what are the ways you were thinking, feeling, behaving that might have led to that performance? So being able to be self-aware and self-critical, I think, is a foundation for good self-psychology, But I would say that coaches, if they educate themselves around psychology, liaise with a psychologist at least, they can take on many of the components of a good sports psychologist that can help a team. I think what having a psychologist enables you to do at a team level is have that individual that's there to drive psychology into performance, to make sure that the conversations that are being had are psychologically informed, to make sure the environment in which the athletes train is psychologically informed, that there's a psychological rationale for many of the decisions that are made, whether that's around the training context or the pre-performance and post-performance context. Being psychologically informed, I think, is really, really important. So, I'm biased, but I would I would say a psychologist is a really important part. But as long as the environment is psychologically informed, then I think you can still do some really good work and make some really good gains.
Yeah, I think then we come to the next topic we were discussing is obviously in the care of an athlete, it's usually a multidisciplinary team. And I think you have your thoughts about how important is this team of not only medical staff, but obviously the most important, the athlete, the coaches, and the environment. Yeah.
Oh, so it's crucial. It's crucial. My first sports psychology role was with a non-league football club. And the reason I was there is because the physiotherapist was working with players, treating players, and the players were opening up to them around the psychological components of their game. And the physiotherapist felt they needed or wanted some extra resource to be able to refer the players onto, so that that individual could then help these players with the psychological aspect. So the physiotherapist for me was the door into this team, and through him, I was able to work with a lot of players. And then over the years, I started to develop my understanding of how not only can I take information from the MDT, and that's important for my role, but I can also cascade information through the MDT to players. In terms of, so as a physiotherapist, how can I best communicate with the player when they're talking to me about particular things? What are the ways in which I can help a player to relax? What are the questions I could ask a player to help them, to explore a bit more deeply some of the things they're going through that might help them in the moment, and then refer on to me. And that cuts across strength and conditioning, all of the aspects, all of the support roles that we have around athletes can be and probably should be psychologically informed. We're all communicating with the athletes. So if we can enable better communication, then we're going to get better outcomes from our athletes. We're going to understand them more, and therefore understand how to work with them, how to coach them, how to help them really. But also spot signs when athletes are struggling, where we need to jump in and intervene. All of that comes from a shared multidisciplinary understanding of the athlete's psychology, and then the coach is a fundamental architect of the culture that the athlete performs within, and they have a huge opportunity there to make the environment psychologically informed, in a sense that not only am I focused on the technical, tactical, physical development of athletes, I'm also focused on their psychological development. And when I plan a training session, I'm thinking about the psychological components of that session. In what ways am I testing this psychological aspect? In what ways does this training develop some psychological component? Because these factors live together, So the coach is fundamental in that respect, but also trying to work with coaches around their stressors, because they're performers too, and you've maybe worked in teams, and I know I've worked in teams where when the coach is stressed, the players are stressed. If as a coach at half time, say working with a team and we're 1-0 up, and it's a really important game, it's a tournament game, and the coach goes into the dressing room to give a halftime team talk, physically shaking, with energy, and his message to the team is to relax, then the credibility of that message is undercut by the coach's behavior. So we can work with coaches to help them to develop ways in which they can regulate their own emotions and work with their own psychology in order for them to perform, whether it's in training or giving a team talk, or whether it's just delivering an education session. What are the ways as a coach that you can maximize your performance when helping athletes, So it really cuts across on so many levels. And working with a team is obviously a big undertaking and a big piece of work, because it does psychology integrates with all of the other disciplines,
So you actually need the whole team to tip the balance.
Exactly, because my resources are really only as good as my teammates' resources. Within any team, especially at a high level, when, as I said before, the physical competencies are quite narrow teams, a single individual on that team who hasn't got their head in the right place for performance can undercut the team's performance. So part of my responsibility as an athlete is to manage my own resources, but also to see if I can contribute to the resources of people around me, and to see if I can make the most of the support that's available to me in terms of teammates, in terms of MDT, in terms of coaching. I can talk to teammates and they can help me with problems and issues around performance. They can give me resources. They can help me to boost my resources, which is, we often talk about social support as the fourth resource. So if we have confidence, control, and a positive focus on what I want to achieve, the fourth is really social support. Do I have people behind me supporting me? What ways can I use that support in different times to aid my performance or my recovery or my downtime or whatever it is as an athlete? How can I really use the people around me? Use in a good way, exploit in a good way, just make the most of the people around me to help me with my own resources. So it is really a shared, I would say a shared responsibility,
Yeah, it sounds also like that team sports seem to be harder to improve mental performance than individual sports. Would you say that?
Well, only in the sense that everybody's different, so I can't just pull something off the shelf and apply it within a team and it's automatically going to work. In a team of 20 individuals, it might work for 10, or it might work for 5, it might work for 15. It's very difficult to find a single solution that applies unilaterally and equally across an entire team. So it's more difficult because the complexity of the psychology involved in performance exponentially increases the more people you add into the mix. So that's where it becomes difficult. But say you've got a team of 20, then you maybe have 10 support staff, and then beyond that you've got friends and family and parents, and so it's a hugely complex map, and each of those individuals can have an influence on the psychology of the athlete. So it's very, very complicated. And whilst there's a shared responsibility, the thing I would also always say to athletes, whether they're in a team or individually, is fundamentally you are ultimately responsible for your psychological approach to performance. All of this other stuff can be very useful. The people around you can influence that, but you need to take responsibility for your psychology. So that can look different to everybody. I might apply a particular psychological technique with one athlete that works really well. With another athlete, it doesn't work very well. So the fundamental question that I would ask athletes that I'm working with is, well, when you think about performing well, how does that look? What are you thinking? What are you feeling? How are you behaving? Once you've got that vivid picture in your mind, then we can work towards getting you to that state at the right time. And that's going to look different to everybody. The best state for me might be to be really, really pumped up, really on edge. And the best state for you might be to be really relaxed. yet we're going into the same game. So there's no single way to help people. It's just taking information from individuals, treating them as individuals, and then collaboratively figuring out what the best path is to help you to fulfill your potential. Not only as an athlete, but as a human being. You know, it comes back to that comment you made earlier about, I guess, life skills and what other things am I doing as a human that's going to help me to fulfill my potential and help me to have good well-being and good health across the board, you know?
I think, Martin, you gave us a good overview of this all. And I think what I also take away is like in medicine, where, you know, obviously you want patients to take over their control of their own health. It sounds like in sports psychology, athletes also have a bit of responsibility to take over the control of their own psychology.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's about the athletes being encouraged to ask the right questions. If they feel like they're struggling with anything, to try to be open and talk to people about their issues and problems. Also, even if they think things are going really well, things can turn really, really quickly. And we saw that with COVID. All of a sudden, everything's different, you know? So don't just assume that you're riding high. You don't need to look into the psychological aspect of your performance. Everything's going to be fine. At some point, anything you can pick up that is psychologically informed will help you, because you will face adversity as an athlete. When that happens is we can't predict, but it will happen, and it's best to have some kind of psychological framework to draw upon when that happens, you know. So I would say, even if things are going well, explore ways that you can develop even further and protect yourself from some of those adversities that we know happen frequently in sport.
Well, I will put in the show notes, obviously, your Tipping the Balance book. Is there any other resources you think which worthwhile pointing towards? Or
Yes, so there's the Tipping the Balance book, which is specific to sport, but I suppose in line with my comments around, it can really help anybody in any performance context. I've got a book around what business can learn from sports psychology. So for people involved in organizations, you know, public and private sector, there's some useful tips there that can help them. And also just from an academic perspective, I've got a book around rational emotive behavior therapy in sport and exercise. And that's really a book full of case studies of practitioners working with athletes to try to help them to deal with something difficult or try to help them to fulfill their potential. So I suppose those are the three things that people could maybe take a look at.
okay, well, I say thank you very much for this, and I will put those into the show notes, and let's hope we can improve the performance of our athletes we look after.
That's great. Thank you, Marcus.